Yes, our missionaries, Steven and Peggy Beverly, they went on several mission trips to Honduras and Africa and someplace else, she said. And you know what? The Lord said, I want you full-time as missionaries. And so in 2014, they received a call from God to go into missions. And they responded and said yes to the call. And then in 2015, they went to Sri Lanka to begin their service there. And because of their call that came in 2014, they decided they should be ordained for the work that they were doing. And so they went through Leadership Focus. And just this past June, they were both ordained. Was that in Kansas City? Yes, Kansas City, where both of them grew up in Kansas City, Missouri. They were ordained at our church there. And so since 2015, they've been serving in Sri Lanka, and they're going to be sharing what God has been doing in that part of our world. And Steven has quite a long history with Dina, because they worked together at Warner Press in the publishing part of the work. So they've known each other over the years, and they can swap a lot of interesting stories of what went on at our publishing house. Good stories, funny stories, good stories about the work. So we're delighted to have Steven and Peggy to come and share with us this afternoon. I'm going to give. Do you want this?
Good morning, Fairview Church. Afternoon. We are amazingly excited to be here this afternoon. This is one of our favorite places to be, and we talk about this church a lot to the Christians in Sri Lanka. As we go around and meet with our pastors and congregations, we talk about this church. And they are excited to know that this church is supporting the work in Sri Lanka. They're excited to know that this church is praying for them in Sri Lanka. We are Steven and Peggy Beverly, and we are on mission for God. God has called us to be on mission for the kingdom of God. So we're going to show you some things about what we're doing in Sri Lanka, but we can't really talk about what God is doing in Sri Lanka without first talking about what God is doing in us. How God has taken us on a journey, what we call a journey of absolute surrender. It's a journey where every day Peggy and I are both asking God to show us things in our lives that we need to surrender to Him. Not just things that we need to improve in our lives, but even the talents, the gifts that God has given us. He is taking us on this journey where we're surrendering everything that we have to God. And it's not a destination. That's why we call it a journey, because we haven't reached that place. It's something that God takes us along on every day of our lives. And it's only because we are on this journey that we are able to serve as instruments of God's will wherever He has called us. And we are amazed all the time that God has called us to the wonderful people of Sri Lanka. We've been there for 4 years, almost 4 years, and we've made some wonderful friendships. We've eaten some amazing food and gone to some wonderful parts of the country. And we've come to love Sri Lanka. We've come to love the people of Sri Lanka. And every time we sit with the pastors and with the Christians that are there, and we listen to their stories of sacrifice, we listen to their stories of commitment in the face of persecution, when we listen to their stories of decision to be disciples of Christ among a community that doesn't want them to be, that doesn't want them there as disciples of Christ, it awes us. Because very often when we come back to the West, we see churches, we see Christians who are just going through a nominal Christian life, and they're not going on a journey of surrender. They're not willing to pay the cost of being a disciple of Christ, and it just causes an ache in our souls as we listen to what Christians are experiencing, not just in Sri Lanka, but we were in China a few months before, and the Christians there are also under deep persecution. So part of what we do as we travel around, we are on what we call a furlough or home assignment, where we're reconnecting with partners and finding new partners for the work in Sri Lanka. But part of our mission here, as we're not on the field there, is to encourage our brothers and sisters back here in the West that it's not about us. Being a Christian is not about us. Yes, we receive the salvation through Jesus Christ, but He is saving us for His kingdom, and we have to be on mission for God in God's kingdom, wherever we are, whether it's here or in Sri Lanka. So I'm going to have to turn to the side a little bit so I can see where I'm going with this. So we are working to develop the sustainability of the Church of God in Sri Lanka. And that sounds kind of technical, but what it means is we're trying to help the Church of God in Sri Lanka become self-sustaining. And that has to happen on a lot of different levels. And one of those levels is through administration. And Peggy's going to talk a little bit about what that administration level of sustainability looks like.
The mission that we had agreed upon as a leadership team is for Sri Lanka to be a strong, self-sustaining, sending body. And it was encouraging to hear that a couple of our brothers there are wanting to be missionaries in different areas. When we landed in Sri Lanka and began to meet with our pastors and just to observe, we saw that the body was not a healthy body. And so one of the things that we established first, is that me ringing? Is developing a team with our Sri Lankan brothers. We have, Pastor Leslie, he's our pastoral leader.
Pastoral care leader.
Pastoral care leader.
I'm talking here, but
Okay.
just turn back.
And then Crisantha De Silva, he is our national leader. He's our national leader. You want to point to him? And then Pastor Benedict, he is our project leader. And so we, and Steven and I, this is the team that we have developed to work alongside with our brothers there in Sri Lanka, brothers and sisters there in Sri Lanka. So first of all, we established a leadership team. And in that administration as well is developing budgets, how to be accountable and good stewards of the funds that people so graciously send to us to develop the ministry and to help them with sustainability. So, and even individually with their ministries, how to budget the funds that, as we go along, you'll hear the different projects that we do. On a regular annual basis, we have a general meeting with our pastors, and that's mainly for, it's required that we have, and so we have the pastors, we all come together once a year to discuss the business and the things that are happening in Sri Lanka, in the ministry, in Church of God Sri Lanka ministry. We were able to secure an accountant to help with that as well. So the administration of the funds and being good stewards and how to operate in that way as far as sustainability. And we know as we go through that, sustainability is not just financial, but that's one area of sustainability that we are working with our pastors with.
Another area of sustainability that they're working on is a national ministry, trying to develop a national ministry for the Church of God in Sri Lanka. We have 25 pastors in Sri Lanka, and each of them are doing incredible work locally in their areas, but they weren't connected at all as a national body. So we've begun bringing them together, trying to organize around a single mission and vision that Peggy just mentioned, but also developing things like a youth ministry, women's ministry, and working on bringing in new pastors. We were recently blessed to have a women's training, and we've had some people come in and help do some training with our women. And we're continuing to work on that process because we found that many of the women who were attending the training were unable to leave for an extended period of time because of domestic responsibilities that they had to attend to. So we're looking at taking the training to them and to their local communities instead of bringing them all to a local place. We've also done some work with youth ministry training, so we're developing a national youth ministry that will be able to work with our youth who are an amazing resource and part of an amazing resource, but a challenging resource in Sri Lanka for the Church of God. We have been blessed to be able to add a couple of new pastors to Sri Lanka, to the Church of God in Sri Lanka. Pastor Angelina Sandanam is here with her husband, who is already a pastor. They are in the Dekoya Tea Estate near Hatton in Sri Lanka, and so she has just taken a new church of her own that she is working with in Sri Lanka. Pastor Sati is in Omadiamadu on the East Coast, and he's a very young guy, and we are excited about having him as part of the Church of God. He has a lot of potential and a lot of energy and a lot of excitement about sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ in his area. We're going to talk a little bit more about his church when we get to some of the other projects that we're working on. Pastor Daya, or M. Chandrakanti, is in Kurunegala, and she's also a new pastor that was added to the ministry in Sri Lanka. And then Pastor Prabhath Dhananja is also a young talented young man who's still in Bible school right now, but he's about to finish, but he's already doing an amazing amount of work and translation work for us as well. He's also in Kurunegala also. So those 4 new pastors we've added in the last 2 years in the Church of God. So we are at about 25, 26 Church of God pastors in Sri Lanka. Each of our pastors, most of our pastors are ministering in areas where they are not allowed to build churches, so they have 4 to 5 prayer cells that they will manage as they minister to as they go out into the villages. I think. Go ahead and do him. This is more. Okay. So this is Pastor Sati. I said we'd talk about him. Part of developing the national ministry is also to help establish brick and mortar churches where we can, where the communities will allow that to happen. This is Pastor Sati's church. There's a very interesting story behind the small stick church you can see in the background there, but it's in an area that was in the middle of the conflict zone, and a lot of people left, and it was repopulated by a mostly Muslim population. One of our pastors in Santivele, his wife, started ministering in this area, and a woman was healed, and she subsequently gave the church some land to build or to establish a church there. And so we were there for this celebration of this new church in 2017. It was a very exciting day, and people came from seemingly out of nowhere to come to this small little church. And we were very happy to see that. But in 2018, a storm came through and blew the church down. So we were working with the Church of God to prepare some disaster relief funds so that we could come in and rebuild this church. We were working for a couple of years to get the funds, about a year to get the funds, and then waiting for monsoons to stop so that we could go in and start the work. In April 2nd of this year, we started construction of the church, and Peggy and I were preparing to leave on April 4th. So we were really excited that this church was getting ready to start just before we were leaving Sri Lanka. And we sent our national coordinator there to take some pictures of this construction going up. It was only going to be a half wall with a tin roof, but it was going to be much more permanent than the structure that they had before. Unfortunately, on the 4th, April 4th, as we were packing to leave, oh, you can't even see it now, okay. The cross, there's an image right over the cross. There's a policeman there, and he came and he stopped us from building the church. So that church is on hold until we work through some of the political issues of that particular community to find a way to continue the process of building that church in Omari Amadu. So please pray for Pastor Sati and the church there in Omari Amadu. Further to the east, on the east coast, is a church called Santavelli, and Pastor Clement there is the pastor, and we have been working with him for a number of years. This church is in a mostly Hindu area, and it's been attacked several times. You can see part of it is in cinder block and the other part's in sheet metal. It's because it keeps being attacked and torn down. And so we've been working with them, trying to find some funding to build a more permanent church that they can minister in. This is more scenes of some things that were burned on the property in Santavelli. Sadly, some landmines were planted behind the church. The pastor says the mines were planted to harm the children because that's where the children played. The government has removed those mines, and we're now and that allowed us to continue the process of looking to rebuild his church there. We worked with a church in Korea, the Sungdong Church in Seoul, Korea, to help us provide some funds to build this church. And this is Pastor Lee and his wife and some members of his church. And so they were able to provide some funds to help rebuild that church. And also Kistan Nunpla from Meghalaya Church of God in India helped us to be able to provide some funds for this church as well. So just a few days ago, we received word that they had begun work on this church in Santavelli, and we are praising God because that has been a 3-year process for us to get this church, to get construction started on this church. So we are very excited about that, and we are hoping that by the time we return at the end of October, that this church, praise God, will be completed and will be a permanent structure that can't be torn down and burned down. Okay. We are able to do this construction as we met with a couple who they were from Switzerland, and they have a school in Sri Lanka that teaches construction skills. That's called the College of Construction Skills. And we met them almost by accident. I won't say by accident because I do believe that it was God's design that we met them. They are both Christians. The school is not per se a Christian school, but they are both Christians. And when we talked to them about our need to build some churches where we could in certain areas, they were excited to help us do that. So they're partnering with us to do some of the construction for this church in Santavelli. We were also able to work with Pastor Selandi Subramaniam in Tagaswala in the southern part of Sri Lanka near Galle. And it's also on a tea plantation, isn't it? Yes, it's on a tea plantation. And he had built the walls to a church, but he needed some help with the roof, so we were able to come in and help him put a roof on his church for there.
Another area where we're working with our pastors is financial. A lot of our pastors are not working, and some are in the tea plantations, and so the members, it's kind of hard for them as well. And so to live on maybe, like we have tithes and offerings, they're not able to do that because if someone to possibly pay tithes, someone may not eat in that home. But, and so what we're doing is helping the pastors with financially sustainability with projects, learning what projects they would be able to do. Some have a goat farm, poultry farm, peppers. This is Pastor Udea at Walimada. I'm still working on my words. He was in a tea. He lives up in a tea plantation, but the tea bushes have gotten. They weren't cared for, and so they've gotten too old for them to use. And so we helped him to be able to clear out the land where he lives, and he's going to plant pepper. Have a pepper project that he's planning to help with his sustainability. Next is Pastor Pegara at Gampaha, and he has a hatchery project that he's doing. He said he started out with it as a hobby, but now we were able to help him to expand on that particular project, and so we were able to help him to get an incubation machine, I guess that's what it's called. So he incubates the eggs, he hatches them, and then he sells them as well. Next is Minika. She's dear to my heart. She's such a sweet young lady. She's one of our pastor's daughters, and God has gifted her with the talent to sew. She had a bridal where she made brides' dresses. She would look at a magazine, or she would Google some pictures, and she would just look at them. She'd make her own pattern, and then she would make the dresses for young ladies. Her heart is to reach other women, young girls in her village, so they can also help financially with their families, and just for their families to have provision. And so what she did was she went to school to learn how to make purses. So she went back to school, and as she learned to make different purses, when it was almost time for her to finish, the school asked if she would be willing to teach young ladies. And she saw that as a blessing and an open door for her, not only to financially, but also spiritually, to help and minister to some of the young ladies and the women there and encourage them. And so when I talk to her from time to time, she's so thrilled to share testimonies of how she was able to minister to other young girls, to encourage them as far as and winning them and ministering Christ to these young ladies, where she is now a teacher in the sewing school.
So we have administrative sustainability, national ministry sustainability, and then pastor financial sustainability. And the fourth area of sustainability that we're working on is spiritual growth. And it covers several different areas. In this picture, we're presenting some motorcycles to several of our pastors who have prayer cells in very rural and remote areas that are difficult for them to get to, and that they had no transportation, so they were walking to the different prayer cells. Through the Church of God, through Spread the Word, that organization within the Church of God, we were able to provide funding to buy these motorcycles to help them to travel to those different prayer cells that they have. We've also been able to, as we traveled around, we discovered that many of the churches that we went to, there would be only 1 or 2 Bibles in the church. And as we gathered more information, we discovered that they just couldn't afford the Bibles and didn't have access to them in their location. So we started a Bible project and asking for support from some of our churches to help us find funds to get Bibles at every family in the Church of God in Sri Lanka. And so this is part of that. We're still working on that, but this is one of the first distributions of the Bibles in Sri Lanka. We were blessed. We had gone to one of our churches where we actually hadn't gone there, but one of our pastoral care leader had gone to that church and distributed Bibles. And when we arrived there several months later, we saw this young girl reading the Bible, and it just did our hearts well to see that the Word of God was getting into the hands of His people across Sri Lanka. Another part of our work there in Sri Lanka is to help our pastors who need more religious training. And so we provide some funds when we are able to for pastors to continue their education and to get their bachelor's degree. This is Pastor Began in Ampar, and he just received his bachelor's degree in theology from Lanka Bible College. We've also done some work with assisting our young people in going to training so that they can train other young youth leaders within their communities. So everything we do is with an eye of sustainability, so that it's not just training a person, but training them to be able to train other Sri Lankans, other young people, other young leaders in their area and in their community. Part of that is what we call our Preach, Teach, and Live PT&L, Preach, Teach, and Live leadership training. It's a training that we provide for our leaders and pastors on a quarterly basis. The goal of these trainings is to provide a spiritual foundation for our pastors on theological levels. So we're teaching them how to preach on these theological ideas, how to teach them to others so that they can share them, but then also how to live out those theological ideas in a practical way in their own lives and in their communities. We've had trainings on servant leadership, kingdom of God, absolute surrender, holiness and unity, and character of God. We bring in pastors from various parts. We've brought in pastors from the States. This is Horace Shepherd from Pennsylvania, and he's working on absolute surrender. This is Steve Anthony from Hilltop Church of God in Ohio, and he's training on character of God. Okay. Another aspect of sustainability is helping our pastors work with their communities. In many of the communities that our pastors live in, they are in antagonistic relationships with their communities. The communities don't want them there, and the pastors are struggling to find ways to connect with them. So we're looking for ways to help them to resource them so that they are able to connect with their communities, whether it's building a road in their village, whether it's providing soccer balls for the local school, or whether it's providing after-school training for some of the students. And that's community sustainability. Part of that is also doing disaster relief. So during monsoon seasons across the island, we'll be working, providing disaster relief for monsoon flooding and mudslides. But on the other side of the island, or in a different part, we'll be building wells for a different church. And this is in the Decoya Tea Estate, and we've just put in this well for them. And that's Pastor Sandanam there. We're turning on the water. Also at the Decoya Tea Estate, the baptisms are taking place, and so he's been able to reach a lot of the community on the Tea Estate, and we've been very pleased with the work that's going on in Decoya.
I don't know what else. Okay. When we arrived in Sri Lanka, and as you can see, our pastors are in many different areas of the island and pretty much kind of secluded from one another. And so when we had the annual meetings, that would be the only time that they would be able to come together and fellowship. Otherwise, they're just by themselves. Well, so there's no one to fellowship. So they have never had the opportunity to fellowship on a regular basis. But as we began the leadership trainings, we meet every quarter, and so they have begun to develop relationships amongst themselves through those times, which has been a wonderful, wonderful scene. It's so, to me, it brings such joy to my heart to see how now they interact with one another. They're beginning to pray with one another. They're beginning to encourage one another. For when we first were there and they were separated, even when we would come together in a meeting, but they just didn't know each other. And as you know, we have Sinhalese and Tamil, and so there was a language barrier even there. But as we begin to come together and fellowship and give opportunities for them to come together, that has changed in a great way. And so it's really encouraging to see them worshiping together. And so in our sustainability, we talked about administration, the national ministry, pastoral finance, spiritual growth, community, and our last one is fellowship. And so in November of next year, we will have our first Pastors Family Retreat. It will be not just our pastors, but we want them to bring their families. And so we're in search of a place where we can accommodate our 25 pastors and their families to be able to have fellowship, so we can break bread together, so we can fellowship together, and even have a stronger spiritual bond one with another. And so we are excited about the pastors' fellowship gatherings, and just to see how God has changed hearts, just to see how God is ministering, helping them to minister one to another, and then even reach out to their communities, encouragement there. Anything else?
So we thank you. We thank you for your prayers for Sri Lanka, and we thank you for your support of the ministry and the work in Sri Lanka. And we encourage you to continue to keep Sri Lanka in your prayers, keep us in your prayers as we're traveling and preparing to go back in October.
So just hang on for a minute. You know, one of the things that happens at the conventions is that our executive, our general director for the Church of God has an open town hall, and they have something called Just Ask. So people can just ask anything that they want about the church, whatever. And so I'm just going to open it up for a Just Ask for Steven. And so if you have a question about anything they've said, or it triggered a question about wondering something else about the work, if you have a question, just raise your hand, and Andrew will take
Doesn't mean we'll be able to answer, yes. But we'll... Any questions? Okay, Philomena.
One of your goals is bringing the message to children in the schools. So you talked about how there's some places where there's only 1 or 2 Bibles, and so that your sustainability is going towards bringing those Bibles. And then you mentioned how much you felt so blessed when you saw a young girl reading the Bible. So how do you get into the schools? What do you do? Do you just knock on the door? How do you do that?
We aren't able to get into the schools.
I'm sorry, pardon me, we are not?
No, we're not. What we're doing is working to develop a children's ministry outside of the schools. The pastors want us to build a school for Christians in Sri Lanka, for them, for the Church of God. That may be a long-term goal. It's not yet on our docket, but it's certainly a need. And we are certainly trying to address the need for Christian education with our children. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? We know that there are many ups and downs in the ministry. I know there's times of great joy, and then you see tremendous needs. And the song that the worship team is going to lead us in talks about that, the ups and downs of ministry. And after the worship team has led us in that song, then Reverend Chris Bonus is going to lead in a prayer for you,